My name is Will Hartley. I am the social worker here at the high school, or EdFF counselor, student assistance counselor. Amy Lestrange is here. She's one of the school counselors who's retiring this year. And Chris Butler is here as well, and you may have seen Elaine Howe, who's a school psychologist, in the hallway. Diana Ennis may be here as well. But we're happy to have Krista Broker here tonight. She is a health educator from Contact Community Services, and she's going to talk about some mental health and suicide prevention education for parents. The high school students have been receiving education in phys ed classes lately. So either Krista or one of the phys ed teachers has been giving talks and giving kids some tools and helping them understand the resources here and just trying to make sure that we're keeping people safe. So without further ado.
All right. Well, thanks guys. Thank you for having me. But also I want to thank all of you for being here. I know it is rainy and miserable, and probably the last thing you wanted to do tonight was leave your homes. But I really appreciate you coming and being present for this. It's extremely important that we talk about mental health and suicide prevention. A lot of this does start in the home. The messages that we pass along, the lessons that we teach. That being said, obviously we are going to be talking about kind of a heavy topic. We're going to keep it as light as possible, but to be realistic, we are talking about mental health, we are talking about depression, we are talking about suicide risk. That being said, if at any point this presentation maybe becomes a little bit too much for you, maybe some feelings come up whether or not you were expecting them and you just need a break, you need a couple minutes to yourself, or maybe you decide, I can't do this right now, please feel free to leave. As much as I would love to see all of your faces here for the entire thing, I would much rather you guys take care of yourselves and protect your own mental health, all right? I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't promote that. So with that being said, let's get started. As you heard, we are talking in your children's gym classes about mental health and suicide safety as well. We're actually using a version of this presentation to do so. We'll talk about it a little further on, but I just want to give you a heads up. We'll talk about in detail what they're watching, what they're talking about, and what they're learning, just so you get an idea of what your kids are being taught in these classes, all right? So, before we really get into it, I want to go over some terminology. How we say things, the words we use, matter. They do have an impact whether or not we really think they do. Now, I know it can be difficult to change the way we were taught to say things, the things that we heard growing up. However, research does show that saying some of these phrases can have an impact on how our words are perceived, okay? So when we say things like committed suicide, what do we think of? What other things as human beings do we commit? Things like sins, things like crimes. That adds to the stigma that surrounds suicide, that surrounds mental health. It can lead people to believe that it's better to not talk about it. They don't want to perceive as if they're doing something wrong. So instead, try to use phrases like died by suicide, ended his life, ended her life, or killed themselves, okay? And then next up, when we referred to suicide attempts, trying to avoid using the phrase failed suicide attempt or successful suicide attempt. When we say that someone succeeded at something, usually means they did something well, right? They did something right. So instead, try to use things like suicide attempt, or again, death by suicide, died by suicide. And again, I know I'm gonna start to sound like a broken record. I understand that this is not something that can happen overnight. You can't just decide to switch what phrases come to mind, but trying to be a little more conscious, trying to really think about the words that you are using and why you use them, okay? So, for this presentation, I have you guys for the next hour or so. I have a couple goals for you. Hopefully you leave this presentation feeling like you learned about teen depression and suicide risk. I hope that you are able to identify warning signs and risk factors for suicide in teenagers. I want you guys to understand the role of treatment and how it can reduce risk. And then finally, I want you guys to feel comfortable and confident.
Could you say that again?
No, I can't. I don't know why it just decides to do that sometimes. I want you guys to feel comfortable and confident approaching your child or a child that's in your life, even if it is not your own. If you're worried about them, feeling comfortable talking about mental health and even approaching the subject of suicide. It doesn't have to be as scary as sometimes we make it seem. Okay? So next up, I want to go over just some quick key terms so that, you know, for the next portion of this presentation, you have some idea of what I'm talking about. I'm sure most of them you've probably heard before, but just so that we're all on the same page, okay? So first up, suicidal ideation. That's going to be anything relating to thoughts of engaging in suicidal behavior. What are suicidal behaviors? They are behaviors related to suicide, including preparatory acts, as well as suicide attempts and death. So gaining the means to potentially end their own life. Any sort of suicide attempt, and obviously the death itself. Now, when we talk about suicide attempts, I'm going to jump down for a second. Any suicide attempt can be defined as a non-fatal, self-directed, potentially injurious behavior with any intent to die as a result of said behavior. Now, I want to be clear when we talk about this. Teenagers, it's a little different, but no matter whether or not the behavior harmed the child, the teenager, whether it resulted in any sort of injury, if it was done with the intention to end their own life, it is considered a suicide attempt. So what I mean by that is if you have a child that decides that they want to end their own life and they go home and take 6 Tylenol, we all know that's probably not going to kill them, right? However, if they took that Tylenol, even though it's a non-lethal dose, they took that Tylenol with the intention to end their own life, it is considered a suicide attempt, okay? So jumping back up, non-suicidal self-injury. You can just think of that as any sort of self-harm that is not done with the intention to end their own life. So it might be things like cutting themselves. You need to figure out what the intention there is. Okay? And then finally, suicide itself can just be defined as death caused by self-directed injurious behavior with any intent to die as a result of the behavior. So, why are we talking about this? Why is it such a hot topic now? It's very prevalent in our society, unfortunately. Suicide is considered the second leading cause of death for the age group of 10 to 24-year-olds. When we talk about the US population overall, all age groups included, there were roughly 47,500 reported suicide deaths in just the year 2019, I believe. Yes. The reason that reported is such a big deal here, we can't truly know if all deaths that are reported as suicides, if that's all of them, right? Sometimes there are deaths like overdoses. We can't determine what the actual intention there was. So this number could be a lot higher. It most likely is a lot higher. So, age adjusted, there are roughly 13.93 suicides per 100,000 people in the US population. Again, if we want to jump down to talking about the age group that we're focusing on today, again, that 10 to 24-year-old range, in the year 2019, there were 6,488 reported suicides. That equals out to be about 13.66% of total suicides in the US. And again, if we're adjusting for age, it is roughly 10.22 suicides per 100,000 youth. So this is a big deal. It does impact a lot more children than it should. And again, I'd just like to highlight that 6,488 is just the reported suicides. Especially when we talk about youth, there are a lot of things that might lead the death to not be ruled a suicide. sometimes family involvement. Again, if the means used were not 100% clear on what actually happened, if it could be deemed accidental. So yet again, even though that number is already way too high, it could be a lot higher. So, when we talk about US suicide rates across the lifespan, as you can see, from ages roughly 0 to about 11 or 12, they're pretty low. However, they take a dramatic increase between the ages of, again, that 11 to 12 up until like early 20s. Why is that? Well, there's many different reasons. If we think about being a teenager, there are a lot of different things that occur during that lovely period of life. Puberty, that could be a huge one. All the influx of hormones that come on. Just things like trying to find their place in the world, trying to understand why they're here, what they're doing. It is a time where we face a lot of social rejection. It's a time where we start to realize that our choices do have consequences, good or bad. There are a lot of factors that come into play with, when we talk about why the suicide rate jumps so astronomically. As you can see, it pretty much stays pretty steady across the lifespan. It does take a dip, and then it gets a little bit higher as we get older. You can see that the peak is around the ages of 54, 55, really quite literally midlife. I do like to note that when we talk about the greatest population at risk for suicide, the greatest age group, it's roughly ages 45 to 64. Now, you might be wondering, we're here to talk about teenagers, why are you bringing this up? It is important to note, because again, when we think about teenagers, how old are their parents? How old are their grandparents? They're probably going to fall within that age range. And as we know, losing someone to suicide, not only is it going to obviously hurt them, and they're going to have all of those normal feelings of grief and loss, but it does put them at a greater risk for suicide themselves. Okay? So if we want to look a little more in depth, this is the US suicide rates broken down by age ranges per 100,000. I know it's probably a little difficult to see. So if we look at this bottom line here, that is going to be anyone less than 15 years old. I want you guys, again, to pay attention to that top line, which is the ages 45 to 54, and then we're going to focus on this bottom line. As you can see, again, they remain pretty consistent. Now, yes, the bottom line, that age range that we're primarily focusing on today, is very low. However, consider the fact that, again, even losing one child to suicide is too many, right? It's also important to note that even losing just one child has a great impact on the community, within the school, within the neighborhood, within the family. It impacts more than just that child. It impacts more than just that immediate family. So again, losing just one child can have a detrimental effect on everyone around them, whether or not they were even close to the kid. Okay. So when we talk about US youth suicide rates, again, focusing on that 10 to 24-year-old range, as you can see, this is broken down by gender. So these little yellow bars are female, and the blue bars are male. For the first 12 years or so of their lives, they remain pretty consistent. They equal about the same. However, as we get older, as you can see, males are at an extremely greater risk. There are many more reported suicides in young males than there are young females. Why is that? There are a lot of different possible explanations. Things like, in our society, it tends to be more accepted for women to talk about their feelings and to ask for help than it is for young men. It's also important to consider that typically young men tend to use deadlier means. So they may use things like guns versus females that may use things like pills where it may not result in their death. So it's just another thing to consider when we are raising young men, making sure that they are aware that they can ask for help. It is normal, it is okay to have feelings, to express your emotions. There is no shame in reaching out for help. It's actually a very brave thing to do. If we want to break it down by race, and I promise this whole presentation is not just statistics, it's just the first little chunk, got to get out of the way. If we want to break it down by race, the highest percentage of youth suicide rates occurs in American Indian and Alaskan Native youth. Below that, 10.79%, 10.79 per 100,000 in the population is white youth. And then beyond that, Asian and Pacific Islander youth and Black youth are about roughly 8%, or 8 per 100,000 as well. Hispanic youth, they have a suicide rate of about 7.5 per 100,000. So again, we do need to take this into consideration. We need to ask ourselves why this is. Why is there this disparity within races, between races? And I can't give you the answers on all this, but it's just something to consider. Okay, so when we talk about youth suicide, we also do need to consider suicide attempts. So for every suicide, it is estimated that there are roughly 100 to 200 attempts. Obviously, that is a pretty large range there, right? It's not just 1 to 2, 100 to 200. Again, this is kind of, for lack of a better term, a guessing game. Not all suicide attempts go reported. A lot of times they kind of happen under the radar. That is based on whether or not they needed to go to the hospital. And again, what was reported as the intention. In 2019, approximately 2.5% of youth in grades 9 through 12 reported making a suicide attempt that required treatment by a doctor or by a nurse. This is important to note. The reason, obviously, these suicide attempts did not result in a death. However, if a child, if anyone really, attempts suicide, survives, lives to see another day, but those problems that led them to that point are not addressed, they're not resolved whatsoever, they are at risk for attempting suicide again. So though they may have survived that first attempt, that initial attempt, that doesn't mean that this journey is over. Doesn't mean that we need to stop asking them, stop talking to them, stop, encouraging them to seek help. So, when we talk about the National Youth Risk Behavior Survey, it is a survey given to high school students that again just assesses a bunch of different things. Obviously right now we are focusing on suicide. In this survey, based on the results in 2019 again, 18.8% of high school students reported seriously considering suicide just within the last year. 15.7% of high school students reporting having made a plan for a suicide attempt, again, within the last year. And 8.9% of high school students reported having made a suicide attempt within the year. That could be once, that could be multiple times. And again, this is based off, their own words. They reported it themselves. That doesn't mean that they necessarily talked to anyone else about it. Other people may not know that they were considering suicide. They may not have talked to anyone about making a plan or even about attempting. That's why it's so important for us sometimes to start that conversation. Maybe they don't recognize that it is safe to do so, to have this conversation, to talk about these things. Maybe they don't think that they will be heard. this is where we can step in and let them know that it is okay. There is help, and we are not going to punish them or get mad at them for feeling this way. We want to promote safety. We want to promote wellness. So, when we talk about suicide attempts, suicide behavior, suicide ideation, all of it is life-threatening. It is important that each and every time we hear that someone in our lives is considering suicide, they're having thoughts, they're maybe acting on them, they're possibly coming up with a plan, we take it seriously each and every time. Because we never know, the one time that we don't, something might happen. They might act. So, we're moving beyond the stats now. We're going to talk a little bit about risk factors, and then we're going to get into warning signs, okay? So risk factors. I like to start off by saying that just because a child or an adult, anyone, falls into one of these categories, is experiencing some of these risk factors, it does not automatically mean that they are going to die by suicide, right? You might be at risk for developing diabetes. You might be at risk for developing heart disease. It does not mean that you are going to have a heart attack right now, right? These are just things that we need to take into consideration because, especially with youth, it does put them at a greater risk. So when we talk about health risk factors, it can be things like, do they have a mental health concern? We can think of things like, what does their family history look like? Does depression run in your family? Could be things like that. We talk about historical risk factors. Do they have a history of suicide attempts? Has there been a significant loss within the family? Is there a suicide history within the family? Talking about environmental factors, things like what's going on in their lives right now? Have they experienced abuse? Have they experienced neglect? Have they again experienced any sort of loss? Have they experienced, and that can mean a lot of different things. It's not always going to be death. Have they moved recently? It could be things like parents getting divorced. It could be things like being exposed to a lot of substance use, engaging in substance use themselves. And again, I just like to stress, just because maybe some of these things have occurred in a child's life, it does not mean that they will become suicidal. It does just mean that maybe we need to keep an eye on them. Look out for some of these warning signs, just because they may be at a greater risk based on the things that they've experienced, whether or not it was within our control. So, again, as I mentioned, mental health conditions are a huge risk factor for youth. When we talk about mental health, again, as I said before, we focus a lot on depression in this presentation and the one that we've been giving to your children. Just because someone is diagnosed with depression does not mean that they will become suicidal. Not everyone with depression goes on to end their own life, right? However, research shows that of those that have ended their own lives, 3 out of 4 of them have had a diagnosable form of depression. So it's just something to really take into consideration, making sure that we are staying on top of even going to things like primary care appointments, making sure that they take any and all evaluations seriously, making sure that they feel comfortable talking about their mental health, being open and honest with someone in their life. So when we talk about the most common mental health conditions, obviously I'm not going to sit up here and list every single possible one, but the most common ones where suicide risk in teens is most clearly linked are things like major depressive disorder, conduct disorder, substance use disorders, eating disorders, generalized anxiety disorder, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder. Now, a lot of times bullying comes up when we talk about teenagers and suicide risk. relationship between bullying and suicide is very complex. It is very complicated, okay? When we talk about it, it is not I don't like this word, normal. It's not a typical response for someone being bullied to resort to suicide, okay? It is important to stress that if someone is facing peer rejection, if they are being bullied, we hope that they are getting the support, the help that they need. If they are facing some of those other risk factors, if maybe they are experiencing some other things in their life, it's obviously not going to help, right? It is also important that we actually consider the bully themselves. And I know that can be a little tough, especially for parents if we know that our child is being bullied. And the last thing you want to do is probably focus on the kid that's giving our child a hard time. But it is shown that sometimes bullies themselves are at a greater risk for suicide. They may have more going on behind the scenes. And that's not to excuse their behavior or justify it. And again, it is just something that we need to be on the lookout for. Okay. Social media. It's a thing. When we talk about social media, again, the relationship between social media and suicide is extremely complex. When we talk about the research, it's constantly evolving because social media is not that old, right? It's a relatively new thing. It is important to consider that there are pros and cons to social media. Obviously, there are a lot of cons. We can think about things like cyberbullying, not great. We can consider things like this constant need to compare ourselves to others, beauty standards, all of these things that go hand in hand with social media. However, social media isn't always a bad thing. There are children that maybe they don't have a ton of friends, a huge social network around them in person, and they get that connection through social media. They feel comfortable talking to other people and expressing themselves, being a more real version of themselves online than they do in person. So I'm not going to stand here and say that you have to ban social media for all your children. Good luck doing it anyway. However, it is just important that, again, we talk about social media. Monitor as much as possible. We do want to respect privacy, however, making sure that our children are safe. Making sure that they aren't posting things about depression, about suicide. It is not uncommon, especially for teenagers, to use social media platforms as almost just a sounding board, right? They put things out there that maybe they don't feel comfortable saying in person. So knowing if our kids are talking about their feelings, their mental health on various social media platforms, starting a conversation with them if possible. All right, so we are going to watch 2 short videos. We're going to watch this one now, obviously, and then in a few minutes we're going to watch a second one. You are going to have to bear with me while I get this to play.
It's not just about whether life is worth living. Suicide is a health issue, and it's largely preventable. Suicide happens when multiple factors come together, so it's not related to just one cause. You can think of the underlying risk factors for suicide in 3 different buckets: biological, psychological, and past history. Biological risk factors for suicide include things like mental health problems, like depression, anxiety, or substance abuse. Those are all risk factors for suicide that underlie and may not have even been recognized at the time the person dies by suicide. Psychological traits that present a risk for suicide are the tendency to interpret life's events in black and white or catastrophic ways, to be impulsive, aggressive, or extremely perfectionistic. And those don't allow us to be as flexible and to cope quite as well with life's stressors. Past history can really put somebody at risk for suicide in a way that becomes an invisible layer because it might have happened many years ago. Things like a past history of childhood abuse, or a past history of severe brain injury, past history of personal suicide attempts, certainly, or a family history of a suicide. Those are all historical events that place a person at higher risk for suicide. On top of all of those underlying risk factors that can be quite invisible to people around that person, of course there are life events going on for all of us, stressful things that we're dealing with. And so for individuals who have some of those underlying risk factors, those stressors that they're facing in their current day life can absolutely precipitate a crisis. One of the biggest risk factors when it comes to suicide are mental health problems. What research shows is that 9 out of 10 people who have died by suicide did have a diagnosable mental health problem at the time of their death. It may or may not have been recognized or been treated. And so that means we really need to look out for one another. We need to learn the warning signs for suicide risk and know what to do when we see that. Just like we do for CPR or first aid, we can recognize when somebody is suffering from a heart attack or another physical illness in a crisis. So some of the warning signs for suicide are changes in behavior. The people around you that you've gotten to know well, in your family or in your friend group, they have patterns of behavior. And when those patterns change significantly, take note of that. Speak to them if you're concerned. Some of those symptoms look like changes like this: withdrawing socially, isolating from you or from their normal life's activities, becoming agitated or easily angered, which we don't often associate with depression or suicide risk, but agitation absolutely is a very common experience when it comes to people who are feeling suicidal. Increase in anxiety, changes in sleep patterns or appetite, those are all warning signs that the person's mental health is deteriorating. Certainly if they begin expressing any thoughts about life being not worth living, or thoughts of ending their life, or even if they're not saying it, but they're doing things that seem odd, like giving their belongings away, those should all be taken very seriously. And if you notice things like that, certainly speak to the person in a caring way, and you can also lead them to help. Unfortunately, there's a lot of stigma attached to these kinds of experiences that relate to mental health. So many of us actually hide or cloak the distress that we're in. We keep our experiences very internal rather than reaching out and connecting with support. We need to do everything we can as the role that you have in your family and in society to shatter the stigma, to talk about mental health as any aspect of health like any other, and to approach people that you're concerned about and be open with what's going on in your own life as well. Having the risk factors that I just went over does not mean that a person will die by suicide, but it does mean that we need to do a better job of looking out for one another. There are also protective factors that come into play and that we can think about shoring up for ourselves and helping our loved ones to improve upon as well. Those protective factors against suicide risk include things like feeling connected to your family, to friends, and to your community. Having a regular source of health care, including mental health care, and feeling supported in that. Learning good coping strategies in life is very important, and we can start teaching our kids that at a pretty early age. The last protective factor is knowing the signs that you are needing to seek help. It's the smart and courageous thing to do. It's not a sign of weakness to reach out and get help when you need it.
Okay. So, as our good friend Christine just told us, there are a lot of different warning signs. There's a lot of different risk factors, right? Again, when we talk about risk factors, one of the biggest is having a mental health concern. Now, hopefully, these mental health concerns don't go undetected. That can be difficult though, because sometimes stereotypical teenage behavior can can actually be symptoms of mental health concerns, right? So, a lot of times mental health symptoms in teenagers are often misinterpreted as things such as normal adolescent mood swings, laziness, poor attitude, or immaturity. It can be difficult to distinguish, is this typical teenage behavior or is something else going on? That's why, again, it is important to have these conversations as much as possible. Look out for changes in behavior. If it is normal for your child to be a little lazy, all right, let's take that into consideration. If this is something new, maybe we should be a little more worried, right? So, when we talk about risk factors, they usually occur over a period of time, right? They only last a period of time for the most part. Sometimes, again, they are out of our control. And yet again, we could go our entire life with a whole list of risk factors and not become suicidal. However, when we witness some of these warning signs, that does signal that there is immediate risk for suicide, and it is more important that we act if we notice that these warning signs are popping up. And by act, I mean doing something as simple as starting a conversation about it. So, Christine went over most of these. However, I'd just like to clarify. Warning signs can be broken down into basic categories, such as the things that someone says or the way that they say them. So if a person talks about killing themselves, if they talk about having no reason to live, if they talk about feeling like a burden to others, feeling trapped, being in unbearable pain, they could say things like, I don't want to live anymore. I'm just going to end it all. They could say things like, you'll be better off without me. I just want peace. A big one is, I just want to go to sleep and never wake up again. These are all verbal warning signs that someone might be at risk for suicide, okay? And again, we can't necessarily list them all here. These are some of the most common ones. A big thing with all of these warning signs is going to be trusting your gut. By that I mean we all have this sense of intuition within us, right? So learning to listen to that feeling. You can tell when something's wrong, when something feels off, or you just have a conversation with your child, maybe they walk away and you just kind of go, oh, that's weird. Trust that. Act upon that feeling. Oftentimes we aren't wrong. So next up, next category of warning signs we're going to talk about is behavior. How are they acting? What are they doing? Now, obviously we don't like to think about our teenagers ever drinking or doing drugs, right? But these behaviors do put them at a greater risk, whether it be starting to drink and starting to use drugs or increasing that usage. Looking for a way to end their life. More recently, this has been a huge thing with like Google searches. So again, are they researching ways to die online? Acting recklessly, which can be a lot of different things. Are they driving recklessly? Are they having unsafe sex? Again, substance use is a huge one. Does it just seem like they have no consideration for their own personal safety and well-being? They just couldn't really care less. Withdrawing from their typical activities that they usually engage in and seem to enjoy. Isolating themselves from family and from friends. And this goes beyond, your kid coming home and wanting to go to their room for a couple hours, but not really leaving their room. Not interacting with you and with their friends the way that they normally do. Not wanting to hang out with their friends. Sleeping too little, sleeping too much. Same goes with eating. Changes in appetite can be a huge warning sign. A huge one can be visiting people or calling people to say their goodbyes. Giving away prized possessions. Drastic changes in appearance. And then finally, one that we don't often consider, but it can be huge, aggressive behavior, or seeming extremely irritable for no real good reason that we can come up with, right? Of course, we all have bad days where maybe we're a little more snippy than usual, but it goes beyond that. Are they becoming more aggressive? Is that not normally their, typical behavior? And the last little category we're going to talk about for warning signs is mood. So, people who are considering suicide often display one or more of the following moods. Things like depression, again, loss of interest, rage, irritability, humiliation, anxiety, and then finally, sudden unexpected happiness. Now that one might seem a little shocking. However, if you have a teenager who has been having a really tough time, they've been really struggling for the past, we'll say 2 months or so, and then all of a sudden they wake up one day and they seem to be chipper. They seem to be happier than usual, happier than they've been in a while. That itself can be a warning sign. If they have come to the conclusion that they are going to attempt to take their own life, they may finally feel like they are going to escape the pain that they're in. They might feel like all of their problems are going to be solved. It is a huge reason for us to be concerned, as much as we want our child to be happy. If they have been struggling and they all of a sudden seem to snap out of it, we need to figure out what happened, what changed, what's going on. All right, so as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we have been talking to your children in their gym classes. I'll be here for the rest of the week doing so. What we do is we don't go into as many statistics as you guys got to sit through tonight, but we talk about warning signs. We talk about risk factors. We talk about these things so that hopefully children can start to recognize them within themselves if they begin to struggle, but also they can recognize it in their friends, in their family members. We promote, the idea of trusted adults within the building, promoting the counselors and social workers that they can go and talk to, teachers that they trust, obviously parents and family members, and letting them know that they aren't alone, giving them different local resources that they can utilize as well. We start off these presentations watching a 25-minute video. Normally you guys would have to watch that. You don't have to. It is basically just a little documentary, if you will, that follows 4 teenagers that the thing with this video, they are obviously ideal circumstances, right? So these kids, maybe their friends reach out to a counselor of some sort, and that counselor immediately talks to the child, and then that child goes to therapy, and then down the line they're suddenly better. These are ideal scenarios, and we can obviously recognize that that's not always going to be the case in real life. You guys may have experienced some different outcomes before. It may be a little more difficult than just calling a therapist, going and seeing them the next day, and then suddenly you're better. However, studies show that showing this little movie to teenagers does promote this idea of it's okay to seek help. It's okay to talk to our friends. It's okay to admit that maybe we are struggling. So it is beneficial to show this video, even though it might not always be the most realistic things that we experience in our own lives. It does promote this help-seeking behavior. All right, so we're not going to watch the film, ignore that. Just to go over the key points of it, so again, you get an idea of what we're showing to your teenagers. Again, it just goes over the fact that depression is a common problem. It causes significant distress and disruption in teens' lives. Talks about the fact that depression is an illness. It's not a character weakness. It's not something people can just decide to change on their own, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. Depression may develop after stressful life experiences, but it can occur in any teen. So even if they feel as though there hasn't been any real reason for them to be depressed, it can still happen, okay? Talks about the fact that depression doesn't necessarily just go away on its own. If left untreated, depression may lead to serious consequences, including things like suicide. And then finally, we talk about the fact that treatment for depression is available and treatment works, as well as the fact that treatment will look different for every individual, and that's okay. Okay. So again, when we talk about teenagers and depression and whether or not they get treatment, research shows that 2 out of 3 teens with depression do not get treatment. This can be for a number of reasons, but again, we got to be on the lookout because since they aren't getting that treatment, they aren't necessarily getting the help that they need. They may not feel supported. That may lead them to consider suicide as a solution for whatever problems they are going through, okay? So when we talk about mental health treatment, oftentimes, like I said, treatment looks different for everybody. However, oftentimes, teenagers start to show an improvement within 4 to 6 weeks just with psychotherapy alone. If therapy alone is not enough, that's okay. Many teens experience significant reduction of symptoms with the help of antidepressant medications. If the depression is severe enough, or if there are other mental health conditions that we're considering like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, medication is usually essential in treatment. And then finally, just something to consider, many teenagers benefit when the family can engage in therapy together. So being involved, maybe going to sessions together all the time, going to sessions together once in a while, letting them have individual sessions. It's going to look different depending on your family and what the child needs. But just considering the fact that a lot of times they will benefit if it is worked on together as a unit, as a team. All right, so the reason we promote treatment is because it works, right? So treatment is effective for 8 out of 10 people with depression. Depression is not a life sentence. It is not always going to be with you necessarily if we can get you the help that you need. Again, like I said, no single approach works for everyone. Sometimes the person will need to try different treatments, different medications, different therapists to find what is the right fit for them. And then finally, mental health conditions can recur. Even if they are effectively treated at one point in time, they may come back. The goal is hopefully that one time was enough to show them that treatment can be effective. Maybe they have picked up some different individual coping skills, some different things that they can try on their own, as well as reaching out for therapy again if they have stopped going. Promoting this idea that it's all right if it happens again, and we can treat it just the same. Another huge thing can be living a healthy lifestyle. Now, if you have clinical depression, doing yoga is probably not going to cure it, right? However, engaging in healthy behaviors is definitely not going to hurt. So, doing things like exercising, breathing exercises, meditation, eating a healthy, balanced diet can improve mood and relieve anxiety and stress. Again, it is helpful. So when your child sees a mental health professional, try to find one that is a good fit. If your child sees someone and maybe they just don't click, there's not that connection, that's okay, let's try a new one. Keep the mental health professional informed. So if there are changes at home, if something gets, maybe you're worried for your child's safety, maybe you're worried they are considering suicide, letting that professional know. Keep track of all medications, as well as tracking any sort of side effects that occur. Speak with the school counselor whenever possible, especially if medications are coming into play. That way the school is aware if some side effects start to occur, they know that there's a reason for it, right? And then finally, just be patient with your child. Be patient with yourselves. Seeking treatment is possible, it is beneficial, it does work. However, it is not an overnight fix. It can take time to occur, okay? So there are a lot of barriers for treatment for teenagers. Sometimes neither teens nor the adults who are close to them, who are in their lives, recognize the symptoms as a treatable illness. Sometimes there's a fear of what that treatment might look like. What do they have to do? What's going to be involved? Maybe they have the belief that nothing's going to help them. If they aren't taught that help seeking is a strength, that can be a barrier itself. Maybe they're embarrassed. Maybe they feel like adults just don't understand or are not going to understand. And then finally, typical teenager barriers, things like a lack of money, whether or not they have insurance, whether or not they have transportation to receive treatment. So, things that can help, kind of overcome these barriers. Receiving effective mental health care when needed, not just for your teenager, but as Christine said, for yourselves as well. Being an active role model, as parents always are. Showing them that, again, receiving help for mental health concerns is not a weakness. It is okay. There is help available, and it can be empowering to get that help for yourself, to take care of yourself in that way. Creating a safe and supportive school and community environment whenever possible. Keeping open communication, yet again, I cannot stress it enough. And then finally, restricting access to lethal means whenever possible. So things like guns, things like prescription medications, okay? So again, like I said, be a role model. So early identification and treatment of depression can help lower that risk of suicide for everybody, not just the teenagers we're focusing on. And like I said, parents are that important role model for healthy living overall. It doesn't just pertain to physical health, it carries over to mental health as well. All right. We are going to skip this second video. I will tell you it is just about reaching out and starting a conversation, which we're going to talk about anyway. So I just want to make sure we try to get you guys out of here on time, right? So we're going to talk about starting a conversation with your teenager. What does that look like? It doesn't have to be as scary as it seems, okay? Some basic little guidelines. If possible, try to talk to them in private. We don't want to set up like an intervention circle with everybody we know and everybody just stare at our teenager and try to get them to talk. If you can talk to them one-on-one or two-on-one, do so. The biggest thing that you hopefully take away from this is listening. Give them time to talk about whatever is going on. Do not automatically jump to offering advice, as difficult as that might seem. You might be the first person that has truly given them this space to talk about what's going on. So let them have it. Give them that room. Obviously, you want to express concern, show them that you care, let them know. Ask directly about suicide. Don't be afraid to use the word suicide. And then finally, let them know that help is available and that we're going to help them get it. Okay? As I said before, always trust your gut. Assume that you are the only one who is going to reach out. Don't assume that a school counselor is going to, talk to your child. Don't assume their primary care doctor is. If you notice these things, it's important that we act as though we are the only person that is going to. Again, just some quick things that you want to try to avoid. Avoid minimizing their feelings. Avoid trying to convince them that life is worth living. And I know that one's going to be tough. But again, if they are talking to us about their feelings, about why they think suicide is the only option, and we automatically jump in with, well, you have so much to live for. As much as we are trying our best to help them, it might not be the best thing. It might feel like we are invalidating their feelings. We can use all of these things, all these reasons that we feel their life is worth living after we have, sought out help. They can come up later. They don't have to go away forever. And then, like I said, try to avoid advice right off the bat. So, how can you help? What can you do? Again, take it seriously. Even if you aren't sure if suicide is on the table here, take the conversation seriously. Do not wait to start the conversation. Be as calm as possible. Again, I know it's going to be hard. And be prepared to listen. As I said before, do not be afraid to ask the direct question. You could say something like, you know, it sounds like you're having a really rough time right now. I'm wondering, have you ever felt so bad that you have had thoughts of suicide? Reassure your child that help is available and that you are going to help them get that help. And then finally, validate their feelings. Let them know that you care. You can thank them for being vulnerable and willing to share this information with you. If you find that your child is having thoughts of suicide, again, I know it's going to be difficult. We want to try to stay calm. Thank them for having that courage to talk to us about it. Reassure them that you are going to help them. You're going to make sure that they get the help that they need and that they deserve. We want to contact a mental health professional for an evaluation as soon as possible. We want to try to reduce immediate stressors. And then again, if we are convinced or told that our child is considering suicide, we want to try to remove or secure all lethal means in your home. Now, there is a difference between our child telling us that they are considering suicide and them being in a crisis. If they are in a crisis, they are in immediate danger and we need to act. This is not going to be a thing where, you know, we call a therapist and try to get them in a week or two from now. They may be in a crisis if you discover a suicide note. Your child reports hearing voices telling them to kill themselves. If you get that feeling like you are afraid to leave your child alone because you are afraid that they will take their own life. Or if you discover that your child has made an attempt that was non-lethal. So again, if they did take some pills, if they cut themselves with that intention to die. So again, if our child is in a crisis, we want to skip that whole call a mental health professional, get them in as soon as possible. We want to act now. You can take them to an emergency room. You can take them to a mental health center for an evaluation immediately. You can call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. You can call this number, however, now you can just dial 988. If you call 1-800-273-TALK, it'll just direct you to 988 anyway. You can also text 988 if that is a better option for you in that moment or for your teenager. Do not leave your child alone. And then yet again, remove or secure items from your home that could facilitate a suicide attempt. Yet again, things like guns, things like medications, prescription pills, okay? Remember, bottom line, addressing your concerns about suicide directly with compassion, with this idea that you care and you love your child and you want to get them help, it sends your child a message, okay? It tells them that you notice them, you see them, you care about them, and you are going to get them help. Obviously, for emergencies, you can always call 911. If you do not know what else to do in that moment, if you are worried again for their immediate safety, 911 is always an option. Yet again, just some different resources for you. There is a suicide prevention lifeline. You can call 1-800-273-TALK, I'll say it again. However, I do recommend you just call 988. You can also text 988. You can also go to 988lifeline.org and chat online if you prefer that option. There is also the crisis text line. You can text the word TALK to 741-741 and you will be connected to a certified crisis counselor 24/7, and that'll just be completely through text. Okay? So, bottom line, I want you guys to take away from this the fact that talk saves lives. Talking about mental health, talking about suicide as an option, and then leading a conversation into other options available saves lives. All it takes is one caring, compassionate person to take notice, to start that conversation. And that person can very easily be you. Okay? So, this presentation is brought to you by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. You can go to afsp.org if you are interested in receiving more information. They have a ton of different resources, a lot of good stuff. I do recommend it if you are interested in learning more. And then, I just want to say that with everyone's help, students, staff, parents, community members, everyone, if we all work together, we can create this culture that is smart about mental health and suicide prevention. We can quite literally save lives. If you guys are interested, you can always fill out the feedback form found on afsp.org/MTSparent. No pressure to do so. But if you have any thoughts, any concerns, any suggestions, you can always feel free. And then finally, I just want to thank you guys again for taking the time to be here tonight. If you are interested in any of the AFSP social media, that is their little tag for everything. Again, that is the website at the bottom. That is my name at the top, as well as my email. So should you guys have any questions, if you want more information about something, you can always reach out to me. I will get back to you as soon as possible. But other than that, I'm pretty much all set. So if you guys have any questions or anything, you can either ask them now, you can come up to me. But again, thank you guys for being here and for listening. It was really great. Thanks.
And we're going to post this online, so we've recorded this, and we're going to imagine it'll be on the website. There'll be this presentation.
Parents where or where?
I'm sorry?
Parents square or where?
That's a good question. I think we'll probably talk to having it put on the website, maybe having a link on the website. What do you think, Amy?